Short of the Holy Scriptures, there is nothing that I turn to for wisdom and encouragement more than James Baldwin.
You're listening to Good Faith Weekly. I'm Mitch Randall.
And I'm Missy Randall.
We're here each week exploring the intersection of faith and culture.
We find people who stand up, speak out, and step forward.
For inclusion, freedom, and justice for all.
It's time for Good Faith Weekly.
Brought to you by Good Faith Media. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. Missy and I are in Austin, Texas this week attending South by Southwest 2024. Later on the pod, we're going to sit down with Baylor professor Greg Garrett and talk about his book, The Gospel According to James Baldwin, What America's Great Prophet Can Teach Us About Life, Love, and Identity. It's going to be a great pod, so stay tuned. Hello there, Missy.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing very well, and you?
I'm well.
Or should I say howdy?
Howdy. That's right. Howdy, y'all.
Wow, you slipped way too easy into that.
It's way too easy. So, okay, before we get into today's topic. So, word from the Will Rogers World Airport men's restroom is that
beep, 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 beep. Breaking news, breaking news.
You are Christian famous.
I am so Christian famous.
Yes. That's the word I hear coming out of the men's restroom at the World Rogers World Airport.
So you are referring to an incident that occurred this week in the men's restroom at the Will Rogers.
Wait. Did you ever think we would start this podcast with a story coming out of the men's restroom?
No, but I can hear the screeches across the country of cars pulling over to hear this story. So, as you have indicated, I was in the men's restroom at the Will Rogers World National Airport in Oklahoma City. When washing my hands, this guy out of the blue says, "Hey, aren't you famous?" And I quickly said, "No, I'm not famous, but thank you."
There's so many jokes that aren't appropriate for our podcast right now.
So many. And he said, no. He said, "You're like Christian famous."
Which is... Aren't you famous? No, wait. Christian famous.
I said, "I don't think so." And he said, "Yeah, you have a podcast."
Like,
and I said,
me and 80% of the people in this airport,
I know.
right?
I mean, you could take a survey in that bathroom and half of us had a podcast.
Right.
So I said, "Well, I do have a podcast." He said, "Yeah, my brother listens to you." And he said, "Good Faith." And I said, "Well, we have a podcast called Good Faith Weekly." And he said, "Yeah." He said, "Man, my brother is going to be psyched." Like, I met you. Again, all of this is happening in the men's bathroom. So I said, "Well, that's really cool, man. Where's your brother live?" He lives outside of Austin, blah, 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 blah. So lo and behold, on the way to the gate, he was flying to the same city we were, Austin,
yes.
Texas. He just kept saying, "Man, my brother's not going to believe this. I'm going to text him right now. And so when we got to the gate, you were sitting there. I was kind of just chatting with him a little bit.
I knew nothing about any of this. I was just sitting there getting some work done.
To which I asked, "So where did your brother go to seminary?" Liberty University.
So you probably texted me, "He's going to be sorely disappointed."
Oh my gosh.
For those not in the know, folks who came out of Liberty University would most likely not
Jerry Falwell
be fans of ours. Yes. Yeah. So it was
college founded by Jerry Falwell.
And I mean, let's be honest, at that point, your ego deflated just a wee bit.
Just a wee bit.
You really wanted to believe that.
But a friend later told us that, there's a conservative theologian who has a podcast called Good Faith. And so that's what he was referring to.
Gotcha.
But I don't know who the host of Good Faith is, but I'm sure he's a good-looking son of a gun. So
surely has also a face for podcasting, right?
Exactly. So thanks for bringing that story up. Appreciate that.
I mean, we had to talk about it, right?
Yeah.
How often do we get to talk about stories from the men's bathroom
That's right.
in the airport?
But we were on our way to Austin, Texas for a purpose.
Yes, we're here at South by Southwest. This is our second time to attend here and our first time to be fully entrenched with the passes to go to events. And
Yes.
so we have been attending sessions all week, primarily centered around social justice,
Right.
democracy, things of that nature. My brain is so overwhelmed with information right now and things I just can't wait to unpack and talk about. And I don't know how to condense it into our little brief opening here. But I thought I would maybe start asking you just right now. Again, everything's so fresh in our minds.
Right.
But what were a couple of high points for you that our listeners might enjoy hearing?
Okay, so let me list three things really quick. The first is
That's a good preacher. 3 points.
3 points, yeah. The first is this. I walk away from South by Southwest 2024 very inspired. I am so excited to hear about what's going on across the country. People on the front lines on every issue you can imagine who are doing very difficult but inspiring work, who are attempting to combat fundamentalism, combat Christian nationalism, combat fascism, any authoritarian or totalitarian type of mindset. They are there at the gate, making certain that democracy continues to thrive. That is super exciting to see. Secondly, I went to a session early on in the conference about the incredible program that I've talked about before, and that is Reservation Dogs.
One of your favorites.
Who writer and creator Sterling Harjo, Muskogee Creek, straight out of eastern Oklahoma. That's right. Sending props straight out of the 918.
That's right.
Just put together this brilliant show on FX. And so they had a session with him and one of the incredible actresses, DeVere Jacobs, as well as one of the directors, Dana Scoulet, who actually directed the episode that meant so much to me about the boarding schools over the last 100 years. And so getting to hear them and the stories behind Res Dogs, as it's affectionately called, was just, as you know, Muskogee Creek, just melted my heart. I just loved every moment of it, and I was grateful to be a part of that particular session. And then the third one was a little bit controversial, Missy. I attended how city governments and state governments are conflicting and how they're working through public policy.
That sounds very
Oh my gosh,
exciting.
it was so exciting.
Right?
And then it got really exciting. They had the mayors of St. Louis, Cincinnati, and Atlanta, Georgia, all on the panel. The mayors.
So
of
good policy discussion, very cerebral,
Yeah.
right? Okay.
Mayors of Cincinnati and St. Louis did a great job. And then the mayor of Atlanta, Georgia, began to speak. Unbeknownst to me, the crowd was full of protesters.
It's like a flash mob protest style, right?
Yeah. Check out my social media because I actually got photos and video of it. But protesters began to stand up and decry the mayor's, what they would claim his collaboration with those people who are working on a training center outside of Atlanta for policing and firefighting. The protest was that is being built on indigenous lands outside of Atlanta. But it got a little heated, not going to lie. So check out my social media. But those are three memorable takeaways from Southwest.
Yeah, that video was crazy. And I remember when you posted that, then I remembered I listened to a podcast recently about that Cop City and kind of the controversies. And now I need to go back and re-listen and refamiliarize myself with that because we do need to come back and talk about
Absolutely.
Again, any of these sessions we could talk for 20 minutes about. Trying to keep it brief.
All right, so let me ask you. What are your takeaways from South by Southwest 2024?
Yes, we did decide to kind of divide and conquer so we could get more content, more information, more knowledge. And I spent my time, one session I went to was about crisis pregnancy centers and deceitful tactics and predatory practices, which, oh my goodness, so fascinating. I really want to talk more in depth about them, and what's going on in our nation with them and the attempts, or not the attempts, but the drive to defund them, because they are receiving government funds, which is just eerily parallel to me to, I mean, your family story about the boarding schools and how governments are not inadvertently, I don't know, governments are
Sure.
funding these organizations and institutions that have predatory and deceitful practices. Again, super interesting, maddening, but people doing remarkable work in that space. Another one that I went to was about sex ed is broken.
Really?
Yes.
Shocker.
Right. And that was very different than what I thought it was going to be, but such good information that, probably the key point that they started out with and jumped off from that I think is so important for those of us who grew up in purity culture. The moderator started off by saying we teach far more about how not to get pregnant than how our bodies work. And I was like, oh, yes. Yeah. But sex ed is so much more about that. We need to know how our bodies work. Right. What are signs that your body's not functioning properly that indicate that something else is wrong? And just how to know what your body is telling you. So it was very fascinating. Obviously, when you think of it in those terms, this practice impacts women far more than men.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Because that, to me, that's the thing you walked away from. The first thing you told me after attending that session was what a disservice this is to young girls and women.
It absolutely is. And just how in most states, I don't have the number written down, but I think it's 27. I could be wrong, but it doesn't really matter. There are states out there in which sex ed is not required to be medically accurate.
A majority of states in the United States claim that sex ed does not, or not even claim, but do not require that sex ed is medically accurate.
Right. And of course, we do know that there are some states also who have banned it completely. So what a woman said was that who's an OBGYN in New York, her mother was the principal of a middle school. And even within that middle school in New York, a fairly progressive state, said that it was left up to the individual teacher what they were comfortable teaching. So even within a school, there's not a standard set for what we are teaching students about sex education. Think about all the problems that come out of that.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Anyways, so I could go on and on, but that's just touching on that. And then at the other session that I went to was about AI, which artificial intelligence, memory, the gut-brain axis, and psychedelics.
Okay, that's a lot.
It is a lot, but I saw memory, and having been touched very closely in my family, my mother recently passing away from early onset dementia, the gut-brain axis, and psychedelic. Like, I was very intrigued by this. Again, just because of my medical family history and things going on. I'm like, great, I'm getting some great information about like how to heal your gut, your brain, the whole thing.
The whole works.
To say I was a little out of my league in this session is, the grossest understatement ever. Brilliant scientists and venture capitalists out there talking about investing in research and all of the medical stuff going on. It was fascinating. I could not even begin to retell it. But the takeaway from the beginning of the session is the woman who was moderating opened up by talking about the body being both chemical and electrical. But medicine and research has focused on the chemical. If you think of all the medications you take, from an antibiotic to a vitamin to an SSRI or anything else, it's all based on chemical reactions within the body. And how medicine has not focused on, or research has not focused on the fact that there's electrical components to our body, to our brain, and how much that kind of research is what they were focused on highlighting. And they talked about how, cancer treatments are such that, and we know this from personal experience, that when you, if you have a loved one or if you go through a cancer diagnosis, that how the treatment is so scientifically, like this type of tumor and this type of cancer responds to this specific kind of treatment. It's all very chemical, very electrical, very like what's going to hit that.
Right.
Now they're talking about that in terms of mental health. So when you go in to see a mental health provider, no longer will it be, well, let's just try this first, or let's just try that first. They will be able to go in to your, to your brain or to your system and say, this is what your body will respond to. So it was really fascinating.
Yeah.
Again, way over my head. Happy to bring more information as I am able to process it.
Well, we've had a great time here at South by Southwest.
But probably the most profound question of this entire conference that we had came when we were able to happenstance. We got lucky and were able to see some of my family while we were here.
Correct, we did.
My cousin and
we are in Texas.
His two little girls on spring break here on vacation. And I have to say that we sat down at lunch. Again, we're pretty brain fried.
Yeah.
And our little, almost, I guess, 8-year-old niece, I call it cousin, niece.
We'll call her a niece.
Yeah. Because I do really revel in being the favorite aunt. So we'll call it that. Anyways, she says, I have a question for you.
Yes, and it was quite the doozy.
She said, do you drink coffee to wake up, or do you wake up to drink coffee?
And we stared at her for a full 20 seconds.
I'm like, okay, so have you heard about the gut-brain axis and psychedelics and AI? And
oh my gosh. And she was so proud of herself.
I mean, it was great. We really had to think about it, didn't we?
Yeah.
So anyways, it was a great question. We told her, we are going to talk about this on the pod. So Mitch, what's the verdict? Do you wake up to drink coffee, or do you drink coffee to wake up?
As I told our dear little niece, I wake up to drink coffee because as soon as my eyes pop open, I get so excited about that first cup of coffee.
I would change that and say I drink caffeine. I'm not a coffee drinker, but I drink caffeine to wake up.
Absolutely.
So once again, we are on opposite sides of a coin. So
well, Missy, we had the privilege of speaking to somebody who was Christian famous this week. Literally.
Well, and also
like just brilliant.
Yeah.
We got to sit down with Greg Garrett, who is a professor at Baylor University and has a book out that was published a couple of months ago called The Gospel According to James Baldwin, What America's Great Prophet Can Teach Us About Life, Love, and Identity. And we just had a ball with Greg. He taught us so much. The book is fantastic. And so we're going to sit down with him and have a great conversation.
Absolutely. Stay tuned.
For decades, the Festival of Homiletics has nurtured, challenged, and inspired thousands of preachers in their God-given calling. And this May, you can be part of the revival from the comfort of your own home. Live stream the sermons and lectures from our compelling speakers throughout the week, or watch the recordings at your leisure, and participate in dynamic community through our interactive platform. Please join us as we restore what has been depleted and nourish one another at the festival. Please visit www.festivalofhomiletics.com to reserve your spot today.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got a very special guest with us. Greg Garrett is the award-winning professor at Baylor University, where he is the Carol McDaniel Hanks Professor of Literature and Culture, one of America's leading voices on religion and culture. He is the author of more than 24 books. Greg's most recent book, The Gospel According to James Baldwin, What America's Great Prophet Can Teach Us About Life, Love, and Identity, is available wherever you purchase reading materials. Greg, welcome to Good Faith Weekly.
Mitch, Missy, it is such a pleasure to be with you on this 204th episode. Congratulations.
Thank you. It's been a long ride.
Some weeks are longer than others.
That's right.
But you're not here to do marital advice,
I don't
Greg,
know. That could be a good episode.
Could be. We had Singletary on not too long ago. So.
Yes, we did have John Singletary on. He did our Enneagram and yes, did a little bit of that marriage therapy, I guess. But anyways, we are not here to talk about us.
No, we're not.
Or not. We are here to talk about your most recent book. So before we dive into it, I wanted to ask, what drew you to James Baldwin specifically, and what motivated you to write this last book?
Well, I teach Baldwin regularly at Baylor. And so I teach him in my film classes. I teach him in literature classes. And last fall, I taught a graduate seminar on Baldwin and the civil rights era. And so from my teaching life, I'm always looking for the things that will hit students and expand their minds. The same things that scare our state legislatures.
Right.
That they're going to read something and it's going to change them.
Sure.
Baldwin changes people. So that's a thing from my teaching life, but it's also from my personal life, because Baldwin changes me. Whenever I read him, through his sort of transcendent prose, I am given a vision of a life that is not my life, that also tells me about my life, which is what I look for in any great writer. And so, the truth of the matter, and I talk about this a lot, but I've got my copy of The Fire Next Time. This is about 10 years old. You can tell it's battered. Things spilled on it.
That is well loved.
It's been to 7 countries.
Yeah.
Wow.
There's not a place I go on the planet where that book by James Baldwin, and sometimes other books by James Baldwin, don't come with me.
Right.
And so, short of the Holy Scriptures, there is nothing that I turn to for wisdom and encouragement more than James Baldwin. And so, the fact of it is I've written a lot of theological works where I refer to the Bible. This was a sort of theological, philosophical life wisdom work, reading James Baldwin.
Yeah. Well, really enjoyed the book. It seems as though Baldwin there's a renewed interest in his writings and in his life, which I really, really appreciate. When you introduce Baldwin to your students, is it someone that they are just newly introduced to, or have they heard of him? And how does it affect your students? I know it's obviously affected you. You've written an entire book on it, but how does this affect your students as well when they engage Baldwin?
Well, they are often being introduced to him for the first time.
Okay.
And, I agree with you. There's a Baldwin Renaissance, and there tends to be a fairly cyclical Baldwin Renaissance because he always has something to say. But he's usually coming to my students brand new. Mm-hmm. And so I think the most effect that I see from them is when they read The Fire Next Time, right? Which is probably his most famous book. It's 61 years old this year. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for something like 41 weeks. Mm-hmm. And in 1963, James Baldwin was the most famous, or one of the most famous people in America. And some of that has vanished over the years. So they are coming to him cold, but they read the first 7 pages or so of the book, which I have said, and actually just said in an interview with your Starlet Thomas, I would hold up against any 7 pages written by any American at any time.
Right.
They read that, they are transfixed by it. It is, in 7 pages, kind of a précis of everything he's going to say in every book he's ever going to write. Mm-hmm. And he says it beautifully and powerfully. And usually after that first day of class, they're a little stunned. And part of that being stunned is they're like, how come I've never heard of this person? Like, I've heard of Dr. King. I've kind of heard of Malcolm X. How come I've never heard of James Baldwin? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the result is that he hits them. And because he's a great writer, they are drawn into what he has to say. Different people have different things. My white students tend to be convicted, as well they should be, because that's part of Baldwin's purpose for writing. My black students and students of color often say that they feel seen in his words. And I had a black football player pull me aside. He would not speak in class to save his life. He was terrified of that. Sure. But he pulled me aside on the stairs one day, and he said, I have never felt so seen in my entire life.
Wow.
Baldwin understands me. He understands my life. He understands what I struggle with. And I'm like, thank God for that. That witness, that twin witness, so that people who look like us can understand a little bit about the reality that he is working in, and people who look like him and have some of his identifiers can have that sense of being seen and verified, that they're not alone, that there are other people who have wrestled with the same thoughts and experiences they have.
Yeah. And I want to flesh that out a little bit, Greg, because you mentioned the importance of having a conversation about Baldwin, but also once you have engaged Baldwin and what he teaches each one of us, regardless of our culture or identity or ethnicity. You mentioned our colleague, Starlette Thomas. She is our resident Baldwin Thurman Cone scholar. She's always reminding us of these great saints of ours. But let's acknowledge the fact that we've got three predominantly Anglo-centric individuals on this podcast right now talking about the importance and significance of Baldwin. Tell us a little bit about why that is important, how we should do this genuinely and authentically, as well as acknowledging our own privilege in being able to do so.
I mean, that actually is a great question, framing everything that we would want to talk about. The first thing is we have to acknowledge our whiteness, which is not something that most white people do. They walk around all day being white, and they don't have to deal with race, the artificial construct which white people have created, because we are at the top of the pyramid. We can be white all day. Nothing's going to bother us. When I have conversations with my black friends about, being pulled over by the police, which I have been on occasion, it's not a fear for me. The worst that can happen is I get a ticket.
Right.
But for some of my friends, no matter how accomplished they are, no matter how well they are known in the larger world, they are still just a black man in a car at the mercy of a police officer. Mm-hmm. And so that recognition of the difference in our states is one of the things that Baldwin helps me understand. So when he writes about his childhood in Harlem, when he writes about what it is to go to the Deep South and be a witness to the work of the civil rights movement, he is reminding me and reminding everybody who reads him that looks like us, that our reality is not a reality shared by many, many people. And in fact, our reluctance to engage with those other realities allows those realities to continue. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I think white people can and should do when they read Baldwin is feel this sense of conviction that leads to some kind of remorse and repentance. Mm-hmm. In all of the work that I do with white congregations and white church organizations who want to lean into this work of racial repair, recognition and repentance are essential pieces of that. And they're not one-time things. They happen over and over again. But Baldwin offers us the opportunity to lean into this work, not by co-opting his identity, because that's not something I can ever do. And I try to talk about that at the beginning of the book. I'm a straight, white, Christian male, and Baldwin would probably push away all of those identifiers except male. But the conviction that I received from reading his work and from reading Dr. Cone and from reading Dr. Thurman is identical. Right. There are theological realities that I don't necessarily think about because of the color of my skin. And I am called to do that because Jesus impels us to be with the disinherited. So that's the first thing I would say. The reason that I wanted to write this book is because I wanted to allow people who look like us to lean into that reality, that this is what we can and should learn from these voices that can help us develop a much more rounded vision of what it is to be Christian and what it is to be human. The last thing is it's essential to not get out of my lane. Mm-hmm. I don't ever walk into a black church and talk with them about race. Mm-hmm. I go in and listen. Mm-hmm. And so it's important to be in relationship with a ton of people who are on the ground, who are in that lived experience, who can teach me what it is that they go through in the same way that Baldwin and other writers do. But I had a conversation with the great black theologian Kelly Brown Douglas during the pandemic, and I thought it might be coming. And she called me one day to explain something she'd posted on Twitter, which I will always call it. And, people were marching in the streets, and many people who look like us were posting Black Lives Matter and, calling themselves allies. And Kelly had posted just very briefly that she wasn't looking for allies. And this was so radical in terms of what I was understanding my role to be that I asked her to call me so we could talk about it. Mm-hmm. And what she said changed my life and may change some of the listeners who hear this, because it just made so much sense, that conviction that we're talking about. She said, Greg, when you talk about being my ally, you're saying you're going to walk alongside me or maybe 3 steps behind me while I solve a problem that I caused. I didn't cause this problem. You caused this problem, and only you can solve it. And I was like, okay, I know what the rest of my life needs to look like.
Wow.
I'm so glad you told this story. I had heard you tell it in the Baylor, the author series interview with Robbie P. Jones. And yes, it kind of stopped me. And it did just again. That's so powerful and such a great image and a great point that we need to hear. So I appreciate it.
And it was said in love and in truth, which is also, I would associate those things with Baldwin, with everything he writes and everything he says.
Yeah. And that's a great lead into the next question, because, one of the reoccurring themes in your book is Baldwin's ability to transcend topics to reveal the entire human experience. Baldwin had this keen ability not to write about what he hoped for, but what was real. Now, talk to us about the difference between the two and why the distinction is so important.
Well, as a Christian theologian, Baldwin is just heading right down the fairway.
Right.
And I think of Baldwin, as you've seen from the book, as a Christian theologian, even though he left the church formally. I think informally he continued to be a person of faith. His correspondence indicates that. He had an active prayer life and invited people constantly to pray for him. So the way that I think about it is the way that we think about the kingdom of heaven, the reign of God, whatever phrase you want to use for that Jesus came to initiate. And so in the questions that I just answered for Starlet, I said, I do believe that sin and death have been created, have been destroyed, even though I don't see it in the reality of my daily life. And so when we talk about that as a reality that's been initiated but has not been fulfilled yet. And so we live in this space of now and not yet that Baldwin writes about in Hope. So when he writes about the welcome table, or when he writes about the New Jerusalem, which are Christian terms, what he's saying is that the world does not have to be the way that it is, and that we are better than our worst impulses, the impulses that lead us to crave power and prestige and privilege. And that someday he believes that love and hope will be transcendent. That, as Dr. King always used to say, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it swings toward justice. And, in the interview that I just finished and in a couple of other interviews this week, I had to confess, I don't feel particularly hopeful at the moment. I have been talking to a bunch of people from outside our borders, people who look at us and what's going on in our polity right now and go, what the hell is wrong with America?
Right.
Bleep me if you must. And I look around and I have to say, this is hard. There's a lot of darkness. And I've done a bunch of interviews lately with people like Tim Alberta and with Robbie Jones and with other people who are studying white supremacy and white Christian nationalism. And, I know from the figures that it's a tiny amount of people, but still I'm startled by the hatred and the rigidness and the movement away from Christianity that I see in white Christian nationalism. And so when I come back and read the scriptures and I hear about the kingdom that is initiated but is not yet, and when I read in Baldwin about this hope that love is going to transcend these things, it is for me at the stage of belief, not reality. I believe that this is all possible. I'm going to do everything within my power to work toward that. But there are days when I get up and I go, I think it would be better just to get back in bed and pull the covers over my head.
Right.
So one of the things that Baldwin does for me, strangely enough, is that, like the scriptures, he offers the hope that things don't have to be this way. And the belief that human nature, if we follow our lights instead of our darknesses, the better angels of our nature, as Lincoln would say, that there is this possibility that we can achieve this world like the reign of God that we hope for and pray for.
Greg, so you have just really inspired me to start thinking along another set of lines I had not anticipated. And so, I think about Baldwin and I think about other theologians that we've already mentioned here today, King and Thurman and Cone, what they would say, what commentary would they have on today's political landscape, the culture at large, and what is going on in the world, even outside of our borders.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, here's the struggle I'm having. So help me through this, if you will. My struggle is the fact that I really want to hope for this better tomorrow, but it's based upon a foundation that has been tilted from the very beginning. Yeah. So the realities of the systems that we have in place, and that includes 2,000 years of the church, right. Mainly beginning in the 4th century, but 2,000 years of the church is tilted in one direction. Do you think we need basically an entire different revolution, if you will, in the way we think about our relationship with God and our relationship with one another to make it more of a symbiotic, existential understanding of the world while also understanding our place within it? Because to me, that's what I was getting out of your analysis of Baldwin, is his keen ability to state the way things are. Mm-hmm. Yes, hoping for what might be, but reality is this is who we are. You always hear it. Well, when something bad happens in the United States, well, this isn't who we are. Well, guess what? Maybe this is who we are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So help me through that. I've been really struggling with that.
Well, the paradigm within which I work is the white church. And that's not to say that I don't have affinity for other churches. I have a lot of friends who are Black pastors. I study a lot of Black theologians. I learn from the Black church with some regularity. But when I think about the failings of the church in the West, which I think is largely what we're talking about, we're not talking about Ethiopian Christianity, for example.
Right.
But when we talk about, race as a factor in hierarchy is something that goes back to Prince Henry the Navigator. So we've got 400 or 500 years of this. Mm-hmm. We know from early historical documents that people didn't think about race as a defining characteristic. We know that there were Roman soldiers from Africa in England, but we don't know because they were called Black. We know because of the locations from which they derived. Mm-hmm. So we are in this 400 or 500 year, I will grant, tilted foundation. And so the question you're asking, I think, is essentially, can these foundations be repaired, or do we need to build a brand new edifice? Mm. And I could make a case for either of those. Because I am a white seminary trained Christian, I am not prepared to give up on this particular edifice yet. And one of the things that I would say is that while I am dismayed by our friends at First Baptist Church Dallas and by some of the folks that Tim Alberta writes about as the sort of celebrities of MAGA Christianity, I have also talked with plenty of faithful people in white churches who are ready to take next steps and to try and right those foundations a little bit so that they're not so tilted. And you may have heard me talk with Robbie Jones about this because Robbie is a native Mississippian. Mm-hmm. But I've been doing a lot of work with the Episcopal Church of Mississippi. Mm-hmm. And just saying that phrase out loud sends a little palpitation through my chest because people, it's Mississippi.
Sure.
But what I've told Robbie and what I've told other interviewers is that whenever I'm feeling really down about the state of the church or the possibility of hope, I think about the Episcopal Church of Mississippi and the work that I've done with them and the movement that they've made. And there's still plenty of work to do. The Episcopal Church is always going to be a church of power and privilege. But one of the biggest things that came was just this recognition that after years of not telling the truth about racial relations and of being an unequivocally white church, it was time for the church in Mississippi to repent of that history and to try and repair it.
Mm-hmm.
That for me was a big thing. Another thing that just happened is that they elected a new bishop. She's a Black woman from Alabama.
Wow.
I worked with the clergy of the Diocese of Mississippi.
Right.
Let's say there were 100 of them. One of them was Black.
Yeah.
So it's a predominantly white culture with a history that does not lend itself to a whole lot of hope. And yet things are happening. Spirit is moving. And it seems to me that tilt is being corrected. Now, whether it's possible to completely correct it in that building without tearing it down, I don't know.
Right.
And that I think is maybe my honest answer to your question.
Yeah.
I'm going to continue to work inside this system as long as it feels to me like progress can be made in it.
Sure.
But I can also see the case for saying, we have screwed this up so badly that it would be better just to burn this house down.
Right.
And build a new one.
Yeah.
I think that's something in our spaces that we travel in that really needs to be on the forefront of our mind, because we need to be asking that question and we need to be wrestling with it in order to get work done. So I appreciate you saying that.
Yeah, because that is the conversation that is taking place within the culture of faith at large. You have, a younger generation rising up who are very critical of the institution, very critical of,
as well they should be,
of church. And they're doing things. We've encountered some social entrepreneurs that are just doing a remarkable thing. They haven't abandoned their faith by any means, but they have rejected the institution of the church or anything that resembles that. And so that conversation, I just love the spaces that we find ourselves in when people are able to be authentic and genuine and have those conversations, and also, hearing you talk about that there's still hope within the institution. Let's figure out a way that all of the world's big enough, the universe is big enough for everything to exist, and try to get back on a track towards just love and justice. And
there's enough work to be done.
There is enough work to be done.
Either way, there's a ton. Yeah.
So Greg, I know that you've probably answered this question in the course of our conversation, but I want to know if there's one writing in particular of Baldwin's that most impacted you. And then I have a follow-up question. What do you think, if he were sitting here in this conversation, what do you think he would have to communicate, or what would he want to tell us today?
So I think I would come back to The Fire Next Time. It is not my favorite Baldwin book. My favorite is one that he wrote toward the end of the Civil Rights era called No Name in the Street. Mm-hmm. And for me, it's a really important book because it takes a look at his relationships with Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and Medgar Evers, and his grief at their loss. But I think just in terms of, one cohesive, great work of art, The Fire Next Time is so beautifully written. It's like, saying, is there a novel better than The Great Gatsby? I don't know. I don't know that there's a better long form essay than The Fire Next Time. And so, it is always a dangerous thing to ask, if Baldwin were here, what would he say?
Right.
Because the last person I would want to put words in the mouth of is James Baldwin.
No pressure at all.
He would be very quick to note that if I got any of the words wrong.
Sure.
But I think using his words, which is what I tried to do as much as I could in the book, put me in the space where I was not doing, what we call eisegesis, which is like I'm preaching what I want to preach, mm-hmm. as opposed to what the text says, mm-hmm. exegesis. So I think what Baldwin would say, because this is not an unfamiliar time to him, he lived in a time when politicians were spouting hate language about race that caused people to be injured. Mm-hmm. He lived in a time where he looked at the president of the United States and said, everything that I worked for has gone down the toilet because of this guy. And so I think what he would have to say into our reality at this moment are the same things that he says throughout his work, which is, tell the truth, don't ignore your history, love radically, not just, in personal relationships, but in all relationships. And for me, one of the most powerful lines I always think about is in The Fire Next Time, where Baldwin tells his nephew that despite our history, despite all the things that have happened to us, despite all the things that are going to happen to you in what I hope is a very long life, we have to love them. It's the only way out for either of us. And it feels like, as I told Starlet, it feels like a grace that I don't deserve, which is pretty much the definition of grace anyway.
Right. So we know what your favorite Baldwin piece is. There, people who hear this conversation that we're having, they may have heard of James Baldwin, but may have never read any of his works. For them, what would you recommend to them as an introductory piece to introduce them to Baldwin, besides your book, of course?
Yeah, besides my book. I think the most powerful introduction to Baldwin is I Am Not Your Negro, the Oscar-nominated documentary film. I show that a lot. And you get to hear Baldwin and to see Baldwin. And he is an impressive figure, just the intelligence radiating off of him. So I think, recommend that documentary film as the best first introduction to somebody who wants to learn more about Baldwin, maybe even more than my book, because you can't hear Baldwin talk in my book.
Well, we appreciate it. Well, Dr. Greg Garrett, thank you so much for joining us this week on Good Faith Weekly. His most recent book, The Gospel According to James Baldwin, What America's Great Prophet Can Teach Us About Life, Love, and Identity, is available wherever you purchase your reading materials. But Dr. Garrett, before we let you go, Missy's got one last question she wants to pose to you.
I thought she might.
So, Dr. Garrett, as you know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So in light of your work and our conversation today, what is your more to tell?
Well, I tell this often, but I haven't told you all. I would like people to know that Christian faith is real and powerful, and that the church rescues people. I was rescued by a historically African-American church in Austin in the darkest time of my life. I would not be alive without St. James Episcopal Church and the faithful saints of that church. And so whenever somebody asks me, do you have hope in the church? Does the church work? I say, well, I'm standing in front of you. I should have been dead in 2000, in 2001, in 2002. And here I am in 2024 on the 204th episode of your show. Church is real. Christian love is real. When the church does its work, it saves lives and it changes the world.
That is a great way to end. Well, we really appreciate you joining us this week. Dr. Garrett, thank you so much. Best of luck and blessings, my friend.
Thanks, you all. Take good care.
Great visiting with Greg. Just, full of information and wisdom. So just a great conversation.
I agree. So I have to admit, he did reassure me when he talked about his college students coming into his courses and his course being their first introduction to James Baldwin, because I did feel a little bit, just embarrassed that I'm new to learning about James Baldwin and I'm still learning about him. So I loved this conversation with Professor Garrett and look forward to reading some more of his recommendations and learning more. But I wanted to ask you, what has stood out to you about him?
As I tried to indicate to Professor Garrett, is that Baldwin had the ability to basically maneuver through the BS of the world and also the BS of the church. We know that from his life and experiences, but his ability to wade through all of that, including aspects of hope, to get at the core of the issues that we are dealing with as human beings. That is the brilliance of Baldwin. He wrote about reality and described things the way they were, not the way the things he hoped them to be.
So I know that probably challenged you some, because when you were behind the pulpit every Sunday, that's something you continued to strive for, is to give people hope.
Yeah.
So tell me how that correlates.
I can remember early on in my training, professors and mentors of mine always using the phrase, make certain to leave them with heaven, which meant leave them with hope, or make certain you always end with the resurrection, Sunday morning, that there's hope on the horizon. There's always hope on the horizon. Well, what if I didn't know there was a Sunday coming? What if I preached a sermon on Good Friday in the darkest of days. To me, that is what Baldwin does so well, is he points out the darkness of Good Friday, and that there are many times and moments in history where we are existing in Good Friday and we are reveling in Good Friday, and let's just call it what it is. It is a dark moment. And Baldwin points that out for us. Whether that is racial injustices, whether that is income inequality, whether that is bias towards LGBT community, which he was part of, he had the ability to look into the eyes of humanity and say, this is wrong. And I don't see any hope right now because of the way people are speaking and acting in this world. Mm-hmm. And there are moments in time when that is exactly the message the prophets need to give us.
So one of my takeaways from our conversation with Professor Garrett about the book, when you guys were talking about, you'd asked a question about the church in a broad sense. Mm-hmm. And Professor Garrett, made the comment, can these foundations be repaired, or do we need to build a brand new edifice? And this is something you and I talked about
right.
off and on the podcast. And so something popped in my mind when you guys were talking about that. And I thought, a little sermon illustration be all right at the end here, right? Okay. Do you remember 25-ish years ago when we bought our first house?
Mm-hmm.
And within a year or so of moving in, there were significant foundation issues.
Yes.
Thankfully, by the grace of God or whoever, that all of that was still under warranty. Mm-hmm. So while it did require a fight, we were able to get the builder to come in and fix all of the issues in the foundation. Correct. And that transpired. But in order to do that, we had to move out of our house for a while.
We did.
Do you remember this? Yeah. We left our house while they came in and had to go deep underground, lift that foundation up, repair it, and then work on the issues in the walls that were happening because of that foundation damage. And when he was talking about that foundation and can the church, as you and I have talked about, can the church be saved in a sense in our context, in our world? And it just made me think about, we have to be willing to step out of it for a little while. Mm-hmm. What mentally, spiritually, emotionally, whatever that looks like, we have to be able to take a step back, get way down deep in that dirt, fix that foundation, and repair what's inside in order for it to thrive again. And I'm still working through that, but that's just what popped into my head about remembering that moment in time for us. And again, it was a thing, it was a structure, but it was still a traumatic experience for us in our family. And remembering that, had we had the tools or the knowledge to repair the foundation ourselves, we would have tried to do that. We didn't. But what I'm saying is, as a church, it's on us to take a step outside of that institution, to dig down deep, see what's there, what's wrong with that foundation, build it back up the right way, and then go about making the repairs that have come as a result of that foundation.
Yeah. Yeah, and the church is the only one that can make those repairs,
right,
and adjust that foundation. Now that listening to you say that, I'm reminded of the text where Jesus is referred to as the cornerstone of the church, not the foundation, but the cornerstone. Mm-hmm. And the cornerstone, the foundation is actually built upon that cornerstone. And if the foundation is wrong, then it doesn't matter how level or how good or how straight the cornerstone is, it's always going to be tilted. The foundation has been poured by those who came after Jesus, and we are the only ones that can repair it.
Well, and that's to the point about what he was saying about his friend that posted online about she didn't need the allies. You and I, when we had our problems with our house, we could, no matter how hard we tried, we could not fix the literal foundation of our home. We didn't create the problem. We didn't we didn't have the capability,
Right.
the tools to fix it. The builder, the one who set that foundation, had to come in and do the repair work. The church in our context, which in our context is the white church, built this foundation.
Mm-hmm.
We have to collectively get down deep and be willing to go under and fix it.
Right. And if there's one thing about, or one thing that we know about a foundation, when there is foundational problems, the entire house is not affected by those issues. It could be a corner of the house, or it could be half of the house. Well, guess what? The white church has not been affected by this foundation.
Mm-hmm.
They get to live in the room where everything is level.
Well, we just put
and
another
straight.
thing of wallpaper over that, Mitch. We put some silk
exactly
flowers
right.
in front of that hole in the wall, and it's all good.
But there are many others who are outside of that white supremacy, and I mean that in the totality sense, that have been victims of white supremacy and of the white dominance within the Christian church, who have felt the tilt and the ramifications of the unlevel foundation that the church has been built on.
Right.
And the only way we can get this thing back on a solid foundation is to work together in order to do it. My fear is that those who are still living in that room that have been unaffected by it are unwilling to help everybody in the house.
Oh man, we could go on for a long
We
time.
could.
Anyways, that was something that jumped out to me. I thought it was kind of worth bringing up because it made sense in my mind. It's a simple illustration in our lives, but it just, again, it was just another example of kind of just an illustration that helped me frame that imagery in my mind.
Yep, absolutely. Well, needless to say, this week has been extremely interesting, and we're signing off from Austin, Texas, your home state. So I know that you've been very happy this week.
Well, the humidity still is not fun, but yes, it's been good to be home.
It has been good home. And so it's been a great week here in Austin, Texas, attending the South by Southwest 2024. Just learned a lot.
Absolutely. We look forward to bringing just more little nuggets of information and more content. I know we've got several guests lined up for the podcast that we've met here that are fascinating.
Yep.
We cannot wait to introduce you to. So we're excited.
Very excited. Until next week, keep living good faith.
You've been listening to Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. This weekly podcast from Good Faith Media discusses matters of faith and culture.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and give us a like and a glowing review. We produce the podcast out of Norman, Oklahoma. Our music comes from Pond 5.
And we're supported by listeners like you. Learn more about us at goodfaithmedia.org.